Okay, good morning. And today we're going to talk about masters of invention in general, because we cannot talk about Michelangelo il Divino, as he was named in his later career by Vasari, but also of all the masters of invention that happened before him and that were very instrumental in what he became. Nothing is made in a vacuum. So let's look at some very important figures at the beginning of the Renaissance. What really influenced the humanizing and the refining influence of the Renaissance. So we have Dante Alighieri, of course. Dante, mostly known for his Divine Comedy, that gave a very illustrated idea of what was with the purgatory, hell, and paradise. This was of great influence because it was written for the first time in what we call the vernacular. So Dante decided to depart from Latin, which was mostly the language used in literature, but went back to the language of Tuscany, which was that Italian dialect that he really set on the map and became actually the source of the rest of the Italian language later on. We have also Petrarch, Petrarch that resumed the tradition of the superb past of Italy with his ideal of antique culture as the universal education of the human race. And then finally, Boccaccio that offered his conception of human existence as a joy to be accepted with thanksgiving, not as a gloomy error to be rectified by the suffering, which the church had very much posed to the believers, that we were there going to still suffering from the sin of Adam and Eve, and that we were there and we had to go through penance to forgive our sins. He's also very known for his writing at the time of the plague, really giving that interesting image of people that would go either saying, we don't know how many days we have to live, so carpe diem, let's enjoy the day. And then you had the other side of people that would just go to church and try to do penance so that they would be guaranteed a decent afterlife. So these three great figures are going to be marking in the evolution of culture towards the Renaissance. When we talk about Michelangelo, we know that he spent the largest part of his career in Rome. And so it's very important that we have an idea of the popes that are going to be the centers, at least for the early career. I'm only talking the early career. So the first pope that we talk about is starting his reign in 1471 is Sixtus the Fourth, who is part of the De la Rovere family, very important family in Italy. He wants to make Rome again the caput mundi, the head of the world. So the whole idea is to go not only politically, but also for the surface of it. It's really make Rome again the beautiful city that it used to be. So he adds things to the Capitoline Hill. He added a library, rebuild the Hospital Santo Spirito, and rebuild Santa Maria del Popolo, La Cancelleria. And particularly interesting for us, he is the one who commissioned the building of the Sistine Chapel, which was going to become the chapel for the Pope himself, but also the place where the popes would be elected. In 1484, Innocence the Eighth is going to replace Sixtus the Fourth after his death, and his reign is mostly marked with an interesting agreement with Bajazet II. Bajazet II, who was the Sultan in Constantinople, in back then Istanbul. He was the son of Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople. And Bajazet came to an agreement with the Pope because Bajazet's brother, Jem, was a real trouble for him. And so the Pope was imprisoning the brother and paid very generously by Bajazet to keep him in prison. In 1492, Innocent is succeeded by Alexander VI, who is a Borgia, a Spanish family. And the Alexander is going to really concentrate on the decoration of the Vatican Palace. And we've already talked about some of these earlier painters, such as Signorelli and Perugino, who are going to work on the Vatican Palace after doing the first decoration of the Sistine Chapel in the 1480s. Now, the great figure for the beginning of the career of Michelangelo is, of course, Julius II, who will replace Alexander VI in 1503. He's also a de la Rovere, and though his reign is only of 10 years, he's really going to mark that century. He was nicknamed the Warrior Pope. He was known for his terribilità, which means that terrible, very frightful character that he had. He has established the Vatican museums. He initiated the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which was falling apart. It was a very old building dating back to the 4th century. And they couldn't restore it. So they decided they needed something bigger to accept more pilgrims that were coming to the tomb of St. Peter. He also organized the Swiss Guards, commissioned the Raphael rooms and the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which literally put head-to-head Michelangelo and Raphael, and also Bramante. And unfortunately, probably due to his character and his big ego, Michelangelo was not a friend, neither of Raphael nor Bramante, and really called on himself a lot of jealousy. Julius also has been credited for expelling France from Milan and Florence. The French had invaded the northern of Italy and had come all the way to Florence and were literally managing Florence. So he was known as the liberator of Italy. We'll talk about the other popes in the next class, so we are more or less with the time. The Pope, of course, had absolute power. He was securing his legitimacy by calling on tradition and showing that the origin of the papal power came all the way from Christ. And they also relied on the Old Testament to try to show that this was just a continuation of the Old Testament. But by attracting new artists, they're also going to cater to innovations. The problem with papacy, don't forget, the papal state was really governed by the popes and his administration. But as you see, these were people that were elected at a rather ripe age, and therefore didn't stay alive very long. So you didn't have a real continuity in the program. And when you see some of the popes lived just a few months after being elected. So this was also the cause of some instability. So I bring you now to the timeline and give you an idea of the contemporaries to Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, as you can see, is quite a bit younger than Leonardo da Vinci. And there will not be a lost love between these two. We'll talk a little bit about it, though I think history has made more of it than it indeed was. It looks very romantic to put these two geniuses against one another. But we have to look at what was past. We have of course, that whole series of artists, these four, Signorelli, Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, who worked in the Sistine Chapel in that lower series of frescoes that I showed you last time. And this, of course, was seen by Michelangelo and will have an impact on him. We can see also Raphael, who is going to be his rival, a very different character. We'll go through him too, had a very short career, but was an extremely gracious and a real courtier, which means that when these two, Michelangelo or Raphael, were next to the Pope, guess who was the winner? Raphael was very appealing, very good ambassador of his work, whereas Michelangelo was a kind of a rough character, and they confronted one another quite often, though the Pope was always the winner. He couldn't hesitate. So you can come back to that page and look at it once. I will give you access to it, but you have here on the top line the Medicis that were leading Florence. As you know, Florence was a republic, but the most influential family became the Medici from the time of Cosimo. So you can see that Michelangelo was, as we'll see, quite introduced in the court of Lorenzo, knew Piero very well too. And then, because of his long life, will also be aware and in contact with Alessandro and Cosimo the Great. The popes had a bottom line, and so you can see how many popes Michelangelo met. Let's say the first pope that he met he didn't really meet him, but he was in Rome when Alexander VI was pope. Then he met Julius II, and these are all the other popes that were in Rome while Michelangelo was alive. There are two main sources on which we can more or less rely, because a lot of things were also inventions or exaggeration. But the two main sources for Michelangelo's life, people that were contemporary to him, are Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari was a painter, and a pretty good painter in his own merit. Lived from 1511 to 74, so was younger than Michelangelo, but is mostly known beside his art, and we'll see some of his art later on because he's considered as a mannerist. He wrote Le vite dei più eccellenti pittori, scultori ed architettori, the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. This was the very first time there was a biography of many of these painters. There were two editions of his work in 1550, where he actually submitted the main part of his work. He gave a huge place to Michelangelo and submitted that part to Michelangelo himself, who wrote a poem about it and said that how lucky he was that he would be recognized during his lifetime. And then in 1568, after Michelangelo's death, he came with the second edition, where he completed the works of Michelangelo. But the work is very party. It's a very biased work that considers that only painters, sculptors, and architects coming from Florence were really the top of the line, the cream of the crop, and really put them ahead of anybody else. Also put down most of the painters and artists from the north. He didn't recognize their importance, and this has been of a great influence on art historians, early art historians that were really putting Italian art at the top and didn't realize, in fact, the great importance that Flemish painting had on Italian paintings too. And I'm trying my own little way to correct that from time to time. He also did a lot of tales. He pretended he was much closer to Michelangelo than he was, that he had worked with him, that he'd become a friend, which was not the case. And so a lot of his histories you have to take with a grain of salt because it's not quite correct. The other person is Ascanio Candivi. He had moved to Rome around 1545 and became acquainted with Michelangelo. He then, in 1553, wrote the Vita di Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo is a way that many people call Michelangelo, particularly people in his family didn't call him Michelangelo, but Michelangelo, which means lamb, Michael the lamb. He corrected many of the inaccuracies that existed in the Vasari book. He also tried to go against some of the hostile rumors about Michelangelo, saying that he was arrogant, avaricious, jealous of other artists. And so he tried to straighten that up, maybe with some bias of his own. Also, one important thing is he pretended, denied that Michelangelo was indebted to any other artist and claimed that he was self-taught. This was, by the way, corrected by Vasari, who came in possession of the contract that was written between Michelangelo's father and Ghirlandaio, and showed that he had a 3-year apprenticeship with him. So a quick early biography of Michelangelo. He was born in Caprese as Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. His father, it was Lodovico Buonarroti. They claim to be the long, go back to a long line of small nobility, which has been also put in doubt. In 1488, he became apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. And a few years later, apparently, Lorenzo de' Medici, who wanted to found a new school of sculpture, asked Ghirlandaio to give him some of his best students and to bring him to his own court, where he had hired a sculptor who was himself a student of Donatello, and started that school, but also at the same time had these young artists be part of his household. Literally, they would have their meals with them, and they would listen to that whole very highly cultivated group of philosophers and scholars that were around Lorenzo. In 1492, he started studying anatomy at the Hospital of San Spirito. That's something that he will go on for many years, though he doesn't show the same interest that Leonardo had. I mean, the same scientific interest. It remains something kind of at the surface. In 1494, when Piero de' Medici is kicked out of Florence, he decides he better leave too, because he was known to be closely attached to the Medici family. And so he flees first to Venice and then Bologna, where he will stay for a year, and we'll see that in a minute. After about a year and a half, he's tired of Bologna and the jealousy of other sculptors, and he leaves to Rome in 1496. He will stay there until 1501, and when he will come back to Florence for about 4 years, and then he will go back to Rome. And that's the time of the famous episode of the design for Julius II's tomb. And we'll stop there until the next class. So as I mentioned, Vasari on Michelangelo, he wrote, Michelangelo's desire to achieve this increased daily, and Ludovico, perceiving that he could not prevent the boy from studying design. When we talk about Ludovico, it's the father of Michelangelo, put him with Domenico Ghirlandaio that he might learn the profession. And at that time, when you were putting your child with a master like Ghirlandaio, you were literally paying money for them to take care of your child. So I want to show you Domenico Ghirlandaio, because probably his misfortune was that he he lived at the same time as Michelangelo and Leonardo, because he's a wonderful artist. But when you have two giants like Leonardo and Michelangelo, it's very difficult to, in the hindsight, if you want, to have a name that is worthy of what you're doing. He was born in Florence as Domenico di Tommaso Bigordi. His father was a goldsmith known for his garland, therefore his nickname Ghirlandaio. He was trained in his father's workshop and was quite influenced by Castagno, who I showed you, but also with early Flemish paintings. Again, I have to stress all the time, there were many, many Flemish paintings part of the collections in Florence. And these were observed by the painters of the time, who really, some did not do anything about, but some really fell in love with the surface details that are so known for the Flemish painting, and also the realism of many of the faces. In 1481-82, he will be called together with the other painters to make the frescoes, the lower frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, in the Vatican, but it also gives him a chance to study Roman antiquities. He will be received in the big commission of painting the Sassetti Chapel in Florence between 1482 and 85. And literally from then on, immediately he switched to the Tornabuoni Chapel, 1485 to 90, and he died in 1494 of pestilential fever. That was part of the epidemic, one of the numerous epidemics that happened then. Here are some of his work. These works, on one side you have Domenico Ghirlandaio, the St. Jerome in his study. It's it's a fresco in the Church of Ognissanti in Florence, and this one was supposed to be a response to the Botticelli St. Augustine in his study. You can see a very big difference between the two. This being, I would say, almost abnormally three-dimensional for Botticelli, who was normally not paying as much attention to the three-dimensionality. But here you have that, what I was mentioning, the detail so dear to Flemish painters of that oriental carpets on the desk of St. Jerome, and a rather static representation of the saint. This was commissioned by the Vespucci family. But this was, as you can see, part of the humanism spirit of Florence, to have these two big scholars. He made a series of beautiful altarpieces. This is the Madonna and Child adored by Saint Zenobius and Saint Justus. You have the two saints at the feet of the Virgin. Again, we have the oriental carpet that you find again and again in in Flemish painting. And then the Virgin in what you call Sacra Conversazione, with the saints and the angels on either side. As I mentioned, he received that commission of the Sassetti Chapel in Santa Trinita in Florence, showing the two donors on either side of the altar, the two Sassetti. And the beautiful vault showing the Sibyls, Eritrean Sibyl, Cimmerian Sibyl, Cumean Sibyl, and Agrippina. Four of them having allegedly prophesied the arrival of Christ. And we'll go more into the Sibyls when we see the Sistine Chapel, because Michelangelo also represents that. This is actually one of the first time that a program includes the Sibyls in the vaulting instead of the evangelist. And in that chapel, he is showing the program of the life of St. Francis. This is one of the latest one, and we'll see it again in December. It shows the renunciation of the worldly goods, as well as the stigmata. This is, of course, when St. Francis, there on the top, decides to completely gets committed to Christ, and you can see him having just given all his clothes to his father, and he's there in the nude and protected by the bishop there who is going to cover his nudity with his own cloak. Very dramatic moment where Francis moves to a monastic life. At the bottom, this is of course the critical moment where just a couple of years before he died, St. Francis in a great a moment of where he wants to literally share with Christ the pain of his death, receives the stigmata on his feet, hands, and the side. The other side shows the trial by fire. Thing that is not so known is that St. Francis wanted to die as a martyr. And so many times he wanted to go and join the Crusades to go and fight the infidels. He ended up being in Egypt and insisted in going through the lines of the Crusaders and went to meet the Sultan, tried to convert him. And when the imam that was next to the Sultan left, he said, you know, I can walk through the fire with no danger because I have my belief in God. And so he did, and you can see that the imam is leaving quickly. He doesn't believe he can do it. And then the beautiful scene at the bottom showing the death of St. Francis. St. Francis surrounded by his brethren who are in total grief. The one person that is shown to putting his hand in his side that didn't believe in the real in the reality of his stigmatas. And just a pure technical thing is, if you look at these left figures, sorry, I have to go back a little bit. Definitely the young Ghirlandaio had looked at some other works. This is a sculpted work, low relief by Benedetto da Maiano, and we can see that he got really inspired by it. Coming back to what I was saying, this is the view of the dead St. Francis. And then the bishop that is at his behind his head there has a little detail, has spectacles on his nose, which was one of the first time that spectacles were shown there, though it had been in sculpture already shown in Dijon with Klaus Luther. In 1478, there something that really is very important is the work by Ugo van der Goes, The Adoration of Christ, also named the Portinari Altarpiece, arrived in Florence. It had been commissioned by the Tommaso Portinari, who was a Medici agent in Bruges, and had commissioned Ugo van der Goes to paint this. When the painting came by ship all the way to Pisa and then came its way from Pisa to Florence, it was a real marking day. People, it was like a feast day. People were looking at that huge painting being promenade through the streets of Florence until it reached the church where it was supposed to be set on the high altar of San Egidio, the church of the Arcispedale of San Maria Nuova. So this is, that church had been built by an ancestor of the Portinari, and he wanted to grant this beautiful work there. This, of course, when you have such a work so different comes in, is of great interest to any artist, and it had a great impact, and very particularly on Ghirlandaio. Why? The Northerners were also bringing, I mean, it had happened before, but were showing paintings made of oil, and this was giving a chance to have a range of colors that were very difficult to obtain with tempera. Also, it's the way they describe things, and you can see the beautiful details of the chasuble of the angel here, but also the realism of the faces of the shepherds, which were always idealized until then by the Italian. So in particular, Ghirlandaio is looking at this. And in the chapel, he's also received the commission for the altarpiece that represents also an adoration of the shepherds. And this is really going to be quite an influence on him, and we'll see in a minute. This is really a moment where we have that synthesis of all human learning in a unified system, which is called humanism. A humanism that was trying to reconcile the works of the ancients with the writing of the Bible. So let's look at that beautiful adoration of the shepherd. It shows what you call a continuous narrative, which means there are multiple scenes in it. You have the announcement to the shepherds. You see the angel in the sky telling the shepherds that the Christ is born. But you also have the procession of the Magi that are coming and ready to come and adore Christ. The architecture is completely different to the one in the north, because in the north they didn't have a lot of chance. There were some Roman ruins, but not as much as in Italy. And of course, they didn't identify with the Roman glory as the Italian way. So you have here beautiful columns with a roof that is not in very good shape, and what would be a sarcophagus that is there as a manger for both the oxen and the donkey. Joseph is distracted by what's happening behind him, all that noise, and the Virgin is in adoration. Jesus is there on the ground on some hay. But what is interesting here is the shepherds. They are no more idealized. They now show some rough faces of people that spend their time outdoor and don't have the chance of all the refinement of people, rich people, let's say, in the city. But among them is an interesting figure we have here. Ghirlandaio himself, representing himself as one of the shepherds coming to see Christ. The next large commission will be the Cappella Tornabuoni in Santa Maria Novella, so the Dominican church in Florence. As you can see, a very large program that's going to talk about the life of the Virgin. In here, just going quickly through it, the first scene shows Joachim being chased from the temple, and here he is with his offering he came to make to the temple. But because he hasn't produced an heir, he is considered as impure and he has to leave. He's chased literally, when on the other hand, the rabbi there, the priest is accepting the offering from young people because they still have a chance to produce a child. It seems very unfair. Here's a beautiful scene that's going to be actually quite an influence on later painters of the birth of Mary. So we have a very familial, a very domestic representation where you have again some a continuous narrative with having Mary and Elizabeth hugging at the top of the stairs, but then you have a series of women that come and congratulate Anna for having had. Anna is reclined in bed while these women are taking care of the child. You have on top, of course, a beautiful frieze with a whole series of cherubs that are rejoicing at the view of the newborn, and then very typical Renaissance grotesque on the column. Here's the marriage of Mary and Joseph with all the retinue around them. And life goes on, of course. Ghirlandaio has now really created a great image of himself. He gets lots of commission, including this one, which is a tempera on wood. So he's still painting in tempera with the Innocenti Adoration of the Magi. This was made for the orphanage to be set in one of the chapels. Beautiful painting that actually responds to Alberti's idea of having lots of people in the image that are all interacting. In the background, though, we have some other things. So again, it's a continuous narrative. We have here the Massacre of the Innocents on the left. That shows, of course, all the women trying to protect their children. There was also a series of small images at the bottom, the predella, but it has been dismantled. Another of the works of Ghirlandaio is the Madonna in Glory with Saints. These were very large works, as you can see, 2 meters by almost 2 by 2, very large works that is now in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. He was also a great portraitist, known for the painting of Giovanna Tornabuoni that we've already seen before. Tempera, still tempera on wood, shown in full profile, the one on the right, with her beautiful dress. And look at the detail. Again, this is very much inspired by Flemish painting. Though the full profile is the old way of making portrait. He's going to evolve from there just a couple of years later in doing the portrait of a young woman. She's not been identified. But whereas the bodice itself is rather straightforward, the face is now shown in 3/4, which allows us, of course, to understand the character of the young lady much better. But this is, of course, my favorite is the old man with his grandson. Just an absolutely touching image of that old man with his nose that is completely disfigured, but that doesn't deter the child to show an enormous gaze of love for his grandfather. This is again a painting that is a great tribute to Flemish painting. That opening of the window towards a landscape is very typical of Flemish painting. It had been started by Dirk Bouts in the north. You can see this with the portrait of a man. And it had propagated to Germany, where predecessors of Dürer are going to use the same scene, if you want, to open up the room and give us a better sense of not only light, but perspective. And but the extraordinary, for me, the sentiment, the feeling of the face of that old man is absolutely extraordinary. This, by the way, is a skin disease called rhinophyma and has been described in many modern medical essays. So when we talk about Ghirlandaio and the fact that later Michelangelo really denies having gone through that scholarship, we have to also understand where Michelangelo was coming from. In Florence, he was surrounded by beauty. And so, in a sense, he might not have needed all the work that Ghirlandaio contributed to. But let's look at Florence and have that kind of recapitulation of what existed at the time of Michelangelo. I put that arrow to give you on the map of Florence where the Santa Croce is. Michelangelo lived pretty close by to Santa Croce. So for a time, just take a breather, close your eyes a little bit, and then imagine yourself take a 7-year-old by the hand and go across Florence. So in Santa Croce, what could he see? Not only the extraordinary architecture of that old church, but the decoration. It had been, despite the fact it's a Franciscan church, therefore should be staying away from any beautiful decoration to keep its simplicity. It had traditionally been quite ornated, and most of the chapel that you see next to the choir were bought literally by the rich family in Florence, who were paying for it and helped to maintain the whole church. So imagine that 7-year-old coming in and then looking up, and whereas the crucifix that is there now is not the one by Cimabue, it was at that time. And so imagine him looking up and looking at that extraordinary sculpture of the very early Cimabue. You must have heard stories of Cimabue, who before Giotto was the great master who departed from Byzantine art. Of course, what you see here is the Cimabue crucifix prior to the flood, where he was irreparably damaged. This shows the Christus Patiens, the Christ that is not there in glory, but Christ in suffering. He would go into the chapels that were on the side, the Bardi and the Peruzzi chapel, and look at Giotto's wonderful frescoes, again, describing the life of St. Francis. That's another of the scenes showing the renunciation of the worldly goods of St. Francis, where his father is trying to bring him back to reason, but he's held by his family and he's protected by the bishop. He would go on the other side of the city and go to Santa Maria Novella, into the Dominican church, and witness that amazing work of the Holy Trinity by Masaccio, who in 1425 really listened to all the lessons from Brunelleschi and other great scholars of the time who defined the perspective. And he looked at these incredible works by Masaccio that were bringing all the orthogonals into a one-point linear perspective all the way down here. And you can imagine that young man looking at that with his inquisitive mind, trying to understand how they could have built that up. He would then, this is a little later, this is actually at the time when he was working in the workshop of Ghirlandaio, he went together with the others. The big point was for young artists to copy the works of older artists. And he went across the Arno River to the Santa Maria del Carmine and visited that beautiful chapel that had been started by Masaccio and then and Masolino, and then finished by Fra Filippino Lippi. And he looked at the tribute money, and these again were great advances on what existed before, just the diversity of faces that are much more individualized. the three-dimensionality, that sense of a circle of people surrounding Christ. The landscape, which at that time would have looked much better than we have it now, because all these trees had leaves that have unfortunately disappeared. And some of the glazes on that fresco would have shown a much better sense of depth. Again, the glazes had disappeared with the ulterior cleanings. He would admire that amazing foreshortening of St. Peter on the side. And we have actually a drawing by Michelangelo that was done at the Masaccio frescoes, and we can see how he appreciated, and we can see the sculptor coming in him with that very strong modeling of the figure. He would go to the baptistry, and sorry for that, I'm missing that here, the baptistry of St. John. Of course, St. John the Baptist being the patron saint of Florence. And look at these extraordinary doors, the three sets of doors, the one by Andrea Pisano, the first one with the Life of Christ by Lorenzo Ghiberti, and of course, the Gates of Paradise, which actually supposedly were named by Michelangelo as Gates of Paradise, the east door facing the doors of the Duomo of the cathedral. And he could detail that evolution between the very classical art of Andrea Pisano and then almost a century later, the first works by Lorenzo Ghiberti, for example, the Flagellation here, showing still a taste for classical art, but a move towards what is going to become the Renaissance with a contrapposto and much more dynamic representation of the Flagellation. And then in the East Door, we have the interesting influence of Donatello, the student, on his master with the East Doors, where Ghiberti looks at his pupil and the new techniques of rilevio scacciato that he's using, so that melting away of the sculpture in the background. On the facade of the Duomo is going to see the works of Nanni di Banco, the Saint Luke, Niccolo Lamberti with the Saint Mark, three very different styles, as you can see, and finally the Donatello, the Saint John, that was so incredible and so marking again in that evolution of sculpture. And when we look at St. John, unfortunately, the way he's displayed now in the Opera del Duomo, something seems wrong, but we have to remember that when Michelangelo saw it, these statues were quite a way up, and Donatello knew that, and so had used what you call optical correction. This is about the way that Michelangelo would have seen it within the niche of the facade, whereas suddenly that odd proportion of the face and the hand can be understood in a very different way when seen from down below. Just for the anecdote, the picture that you see on the right was done by one of my students when I was teaching at ASU, and he was in Florence, and I had begged him, I said, can you please go and try to make a picture of St. John seen from the bottom so we can understand that optical correction? And the kid was so great, he literally laid down on the floor and took the picture and was almost arrested by the guard for doing so. But you can understand much better now why you have an emphasis on the face that is larger. This is going to be seen again in other works of Michelangelo who understand this. He will look at the whole series of sculpture on Or San Michele, including the great St. George, by Donatello also. The sculpture itself is wonderful. It's an early work of Donatello. But what is the most stunning is probably what is at the foot of St. George, is that almost, we can call it almost, it's a base, it's almost like a predella that describes the story of St. George and the dragon and the princess. And this is where Donatello creates that new technique that's called the rilievo schiacciato, which is, as I mentioned, it's really that melting away within the marble. When you think of the depth of that relief and how much Donatello is able to give you that sense of perspective and depth of the scene, thanks to that rilievo schiacciato. Compare it to the works of Nanni di Bacco, who was a very good sculptor in his own mind, but was very traditional. Moving to San Lorenzo, which is going to play later on a great role in the life of Michelangelo, but he's looking at the old sacristy. This didn't exist. This was built by Michelangelo later on. So forget about this when Michelangelo was there. And he is going to see that Church of San Lorenzo lacking a facade, that actually later on Michelangelo will be given the commission to decorate, and unfortunately, by lack of money and the political system at the time, is never going to finish it. But he's going by the inside and see the extraordinary work by Brunelleschi with that Pietra Serena, that gray contrast of that light gray stone with the white walls that really put it in evidence, and the very typical work by Brunelleschi, very rhythmic and very much the basis for the Renaissance work. He's going to go into the old sacristy, also decorated by Brunelleschi and by the Della Robbia and Donatello. So three great names that precede Michelangelo. And admire again that whole work that is based on the golden number, on the golden ratio, very much the center of the perfection of the early Renaissance. Man-made world echoes God created world. This is what they were trying to prove. He's looking also at the dome. These domes always attract the attention. And we know how much it will play a role in Michelangelo's life. A little more to the west is the Hospitale De Linocenti, the foundling hospital that was also designed and constructed by Brunelleschi. Again, that proof of that rhythm, that clarity and symmetry that is so typical of the early Renaissance. And he would probably witness in the different collections that he was able to visit thanks to the Medici, is the Battle of San Romano, one of the three big battle scene by Paolo Uccello, that was so much in love with the newfound perspective, the works. And he's emphasizing all that perspective with the lenses, the broken lenses, and the directions of the bodies. It's still not quite perfected, but this is what built up to come to what Michelangelo will find in a new freedom because of the work of these great artists. This is the Mazzocchi. This is the typically Florentine headrest. And Paolo Uccello was known to spend his night literally doing some works. And when you see that perspective study of a chalice here, This is the original, but to make it clearer, I show you the design. This looks like a work that has been produced by a computer, not by a human being. And then, of course, the Duomo with the great dome that was finally designed by Brunelleschi when everybody had failed. He's going to complete that Duomo that was so beautiful and so central to the life of Florence. Extraordinary dome, double dome, because because literally of the weight of the dome. You have the exterior dome, and then you have the internal dome. Brunelleschi, who had spent some time in Rome, had definitely studied how the Pantheon's dome was made. Going to get inspired by it, though he's going to modify it his own way. But this is one of the domes that are going to be very instrumental in the design of the St. Peter's Dome that Michelangelo will make later on. It is in the palace of the Medici that he's going to spend 2 to 3 years. Lorenzo, who loved painting and sculpture, was grieved that no famous sculptor lived in his day to equal the great painters who then flourished. There was an enormous amount of great painters in Florence, though there were some good sculptors. Verrocchio is one of them. And he decided to found a school. And so this is when he asked Domenico Ghirlandaio to send him the best student that he had. And Domenico elected among them Michelangelo and Francesco Granaccio. And it is in that courtyard of the Medici Palace that a lot of the sculptures were displayed. Originally, the David, the small David, the early David was there, and many other works. So for young people interested in sculpture, you can imagine them just walking around all these sculptures and trying to impregnate themselves with that extraordinary surrounding. And here are two of the Davids. The first one by Donatello was displayed in that courtyard until the first time the Medici were left, and then was replaced by the Verrocchio young David that you see on the right. Again, very typical works of the Renaissance with the contrapposto, the attitude. This is a young David is represented very young, still vulnerable in front of the giant, and you have the big head of Goliath at their feet. And then finally, his foe, his rival, though quite older and more completely different in personality, Leonardo spent many years in Florence when Michelangelo was there, and there is some tales of both of them confronting one another, and Michelangelo literally deriding Leonardo because he never finished the great sculpture of the horse that he had done, but this not taking into account the fact that Leonardo was in no way responsible for not getting the bronze that he was promised. But again, here we see the works. This is that wonderful study of Leonardo for his Adoration of the Magi that shows the preparatory work that all these artists were making that would disappear once they were doing the final work. But at least at that time, they had a good sense of scale of the different figures. And this was to finish as this is the background for this painting that was never finished of the Adoration of the Magi by Leonardo. And so I'm going to take a break before we now step in Michelangelo's career. And so please come back to me. I see that I have one chat. Want to know more about the perspective. Yes, so I think this is a perfect question. Somebody wants me to talk a little more about perspective. Yes, when an artist was making a work at that time, he would make a preparatory drawing, as you see here with Leonardo, and giving him a chance to have the architecture set properly, the different figures at a proper scale with the diminishing, vanishing point. And of course, once that drawing was done, then they just had to forget about the lines and just use the figures, as you can see in the painting, the early stages of the painting that you see on the right. So please, yes.
Did they do that on? Was that done on paper before?
Yes, at that time paper was getting more usual. So they would have sheets and that they would use to the max. So you had drawings on both sides. They would, because paper was expensive still. So,
but that would not be the same size as the actual painting. Of
course. No. All these paintings, depending on the scale, whatever, were always done on a small format first, because they had to submit it to the people that had commissioned it. Oh, and so they had to make sure that people were in agreement with it. They would show it, and then they would put it to the large scale with the help often of grids and other ways.
Oh, so they used a grid. So then they would send it to the person who commissioned it, and maybe the guy would say, "Oh, there's too many angels in here." Or give me another, give me a saint in a red dress over here or something.
Yeah, no, and if it's a religious painting, often the program was defined by some clerics, by some priest, or some, if it was another, you had, for example, at the court of Lorenzo de' Medici, you had Marcello Ficino and you had Poliziano, who were great scholars. And if they had anything to say, they would say, we need at least this and this. And remember, at that time, there was this and this and this. So they would have a basis for what they were presenting.
Did they charge more for the number of figures? Like if you wanted like another group of angels at the top of the altar, would that cost more money?
That would have made a big difference. But the contracts were established. And so you had terms in the contract that they would follow. Okay. And the contracts would say, first of all, how much was done by the master and by his assistants, because they always had, a workshop. They would say what kind of material they were using. For example, if they wanted a lot of gold, what quality of gold they were using. Often they were providing the gold themselves. In the case of the blue, the lapis lazuli was the best blue that could be used, a very deep, rich blue. But lapis lazuli was very expensive, was coming from Afghanistan. And so you had different qualities of lapis lazuli. The one coming from Russia was not as good. It didn't have as much gold sparkle. And so typically, again, the patron would often provide, to make sure that it had the best quality, he would provide these type of pigments to the painter.
Did the patron have anything to say about, for example, what they wore, like if they were presented in what would have been contemporary dress or more?
That was the spirit of the work, and I assume there was a discussion between the painter and the patron. So that these are, I think sometimes the patron would just say, okay, we need that. And you see, he would see another work, say, I'd like that thing, I would like that to be in that spirit. So it depended on how scholarly the patrons were and how much they relied on the works.
So they might want more realism or historical realism, or they might not.
Yeah, you will find that some are very conservative, and we've seen that before with, when there was that ambiguity between Byzantine style and the beginning of the Renaissance. Some patrons wanted the Byzantine style because that was the tradition. But then some were more avant-garde and wanted, the early Renaissance. So it's going to change, yeah.
And how are the prices? How are the value of a commission? Was it negotiated, or just the patron a certain amount of money and said, I pay this? How does it work?
it was, as I say, first it depended on the size. It depended on how much the patron wanted the contribution of the master. As I said, on frescoes, for example, these were works that were lasting 3-4 years sometimes. And so he was there with his workshop. And so the patron would say, I want, let's say, 50% of that made by the master. Or I want the master to do at least the figures of the most important people in each of the frescoes. And the landscape can be made by the assistant. So this was all decided. That's something that went all the way to the 18th century. They would agree on that, and the more the master would contribute, the more expensive it would be.
So another thing you said is in the development or the education of Michelangelo, the workshop owner would send him to churches to copy or to...
Yes, that's typical. The early schooling of youngsters that were in a workshop, the first thing they had to do was copy the works of the older masters. And so they would go in Florence, they just had to cross the Arno to see Massacre, or they go to Santa Croce or other places to see Giotto or the Taddeo Gaddi, and they had so many Fra Angelico. They go to the San Marco and they had all the Fra Angelico, and then they would go to another place, see the Filippo Lippi. It was non-ending, the quantity of the things they could see. And that was the best way to learn. It's to copy, copy, copy. So in later years, because they were more able to have drawings, for example, they started by copying drawings before copying a painting, because there you had a line that you could copy.
Cool.
Oh yeah, that was very much part of that evolution.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other question? Let me see if we have one more. Oh, the Massacre of the Innocent, Ginny. Yes, this is part of the New Testament. When you read the New Testament, when shortly after Jesus was born, they were warned that Herodes had been told that he was going to be replaced by a man who was just born. And so he decided that he would send his soldiers, and they killed all the firstborn of the families. But Mary and Joseph were warned, and they fled to Egypt.
Oh.
So that is when it happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're going to go on because we now are going to look at, so I'm going to mute you again to make sure we don't hear any background, and then we'll talk again at the end. Okay, so the continuation. As I mentioned, Ghirlandaio was very interested by Flemish paintings, and Flemish and Northern, let's say. I don't want to discriminate against the others, but he must have had a collection of prints. By 1480, there are already some prints and some reproductions of work that were done up north. And so this is interesting that Michelangelo, when he was there, was able to see these works. And so we have that early work, one of the very early work of Michelangelo is a copy in painting of a engraving by Martin Schongauer, who was a wonderful artist in the North in the late 15th century. This shows that incredible view of the temptation of St. Anthony, that is kind of that whirling image of demons that surround the poor saint. And Michelangelo has changed that slightly, giving it the landscape also putting in some colors. And these are very reminiscent of Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch's work. This is, by the way, one of the only 4 panel paintings by Michelangelo. The first work, sculptural work that we have is this Madonna of the Stairs, made in marble. This is his earliest known work in marble. It's carved, as you can see, very shallow relief. And as I showed you earlier, very much the result of an observation of the works of Donatello, particularly in the St. George and the Dragon. Now, we can identify already some things that are very typical of Michelangelo. And some is that particular posture of Christ, which doesn't seem to be quite natural. Christ is nursing, he's drinking the Virgin's milk, but that torsion of the body is very typical of what Michelangelo is often showing, that it's a very dynamic movement. But again, you can see how he's exploring the works of his predecessors, and particularly in that rilievo schiacciato, that he's going to bring, he's not going to stick to that style, but it definitely will have an influence on him. He is at the court of Lorenzo de' Medici. He is going to meet some people. Again, imagine that young man, he's 15, sitting at the table of Lorenzo de' Medici, sitting next to his son Piero de' Medici, and the cousin who has been adopted after Giuliano died. His brother was assassinated. Lorenzo decided to adopt his actually illegitimate child, who is Giulio di Giuliano de' Medici, who is going to become a pope later on. And so we have Piero, who is only going, once he succeeds his father, only going to be there for 4 years before being thrown out of Florence. But it just tells you that kind of atmosphere that Michelangelo was exposed to, coming from a family that was a rather rugged family. The father was a really difficult character, and he supported all his siblings his entire life, as well as his father. But imagine too that at that table very often were sitting Marsilio Ficino, Angelo Poliziano, this great mind of Florence, humanism. So great conversation, whereas Michelangelo, you cannot call him a scholar, but he was a good listener. And you can believe that he took a lot of lessons. Poliziano pushed him, gave him some ideas for some subjects, and we'll see that in a minute. So really very important few years in the education of the young Michelangelo. The second work that we have by him is that Battle of the Lapide the Centaur, definitely influenced by sarcophagi, by Roman sarcophagi, but also by works that were made shortly before him that he would have seen. Let's just look at that work before we go to the influence. We see different type of carving in this. This is what typically what they say unfinished parts of the relief that has become a signature of Michelangelo, that what they call in Italian the non-finito, is just unfinished work that some people attributed at the time, okay, he didn't have the time to finish it. So it is, but in fact, it becomes part of his style. Let's look at the tools that he's using. The tools that he uses there have a very different goal, if you want. So the very fine details would be done with, you would have first the subia chisel that really goes and digs in. And then the gradina chisel would, with the teeth mark that you see there, would be able to soften and take away the marble in a softened manner. And then you would finish the work with the rasp chisel, as you can see, different shapes of rasp that would help just defining the shapes. And then you would finish it with a very fine grain paper. Definitely Michelangelo, in that story of the lapith and centaurs, is inspiring himself from that work by Bertoldo di Giovanni, that battle with Hercules, that he definitely had seen. That must have been part of the collection of the Medici. And that work was itself influenced by the works of the Pollaiuolo brothers, the Battle of the Ten Nudes, where we can see the interest in the anatomy is paramount, and where Antonio is showing different figures seen from different angles to understand the musculature. The subject, and I'm going to go back to it now, the subject of that was used by Michelangelo was most probably suggested by Poliziano, that is known to have recounted the whole story of the lapis and the centaurs to him. That battle depicted takes place between the two sides at the wedding feast of Pirithous, who was the king of the lapis. And they had long clashed with their neighbor, the centaurs. To mark his good intention, Pirithous invited the centaur to his wedding, to Hippodamia, his bride. Some of the centaurs who had drank a little too much, when the bride was presented, one of the centaurs jumped on her. And so this started that immediate clash, as you can imagine, but was followed by a 1 year long war before the centaurs lost and were expelled from Thessaly to the northwest. So this is the story of so this is one of these work, and we can find, okay, that search of Michelangelo for his time. Here he's definitely looking, as you can see, he's inspired by distortion of some of the bodies by Bertoldo. So I want to show you now, because we always talk about sculpting. This is such a difficult art. So I want to show you that very small display made by the Getty that's going to give you an idea of the difficulty of sculpting.
The basic tools are the same as the ancients. It's hard in just giving a list of tools. How does that translate into a beautiful work of art? Working by hand, everything slows down, and you can think about what you're doing while you're doing it. You start roughing out, taking the bulk of the weight off with a point chisel, which concentrates all the force of your blow at one point and bursts the stone away. Your next step after that, having removed the bulk of the material, is to model your form with the tooth chisel. A tooth chisel is basically the comb, and you use a tooth chisel to model form, while at the same time remove stone fairly quickly. Something to remember about marble carving, it's very tactile. The way the stone bursts from a point chisel, or the way your tooth chisel just kind of swims through the stone. It's a hard material, but you can jump into a piece of space with these tools. if you cut at a very oblique angle to the stone, you can get a finer surface. If you're forcing the tool straight into the stone, you can get quite a different texture. The rasp is just a whole row of fine little teeth cut into a piece of metal. And you can then just rub or grind this tool into the stone, removing material, and really refine a plane. Depending on how you use the tool, you can really emphasize certain forms. If you kind of lose your ego and just flow into the stone through your tools, there's no end of possibilities of what you can do inside that space.
So this, I hope, gives you an idea of the difficulty. We keep forgetting that when we see the work of Michelangelo. So when Lorenzo de' Medici dies, Michelangelo is going to leave the court of Lorenzo and goes back home. And he's going to start doing some other sculpture. He started a sculpture of Hercules that unfortunately was traced all the way to Fontainebleau in the 16th century, but in the 17th century, sorry, but disappeared, and we don't have any idea. He was also called back to the court, and there's an interesting episode there where Piero, the successor, the son of Lorenzo, called him after a very unusual snowstorm in Florence and asked Michelangelo to make a snow statue for Piero. And I think this must not have been taken very lightly by Michelangelo, who must not have loved that kind of duty. Sorry. This sculpture by Michelangelo has been attributed pretty surely to him, and is part of a series of small wooden crucifix that were made at that time, and we find that it was made by Donatello prior to him and Brunelleschi. These are small statues. What we see here too is the fact it would have normally have a loincloth and a crown of thorn, which I have added now. And this is more or less the way it would have looked. And so would have the one by Brunelleschi that you see on the right that is missing the loincloth. This is just a tradition of the times. These are not, actually this is not that small, because the one there is about 1.5 meters. So it's the crucifix itself is about life size. But these are crucifixes. Crucifix that would be traditionally done and commissioned by some of the people. This is the only work made of wood that we have by Michelangelo. It's a very different technique compared to the stone carving. Michelangelo was interested in anatomy. He was provided in his early time, so in the 90s, 1490s, he was provided a room and bodies for dissection in the monastery next to Santo Spirito. Probably he didn't do the dissection, but observed a skilled surgeon. As I mentioned before, contrary to Leonardo, his scientific curiosity was kind of limited. This one that is a later work, but because Michelangelo went on, shows what you call the red choke écorché drawing. So it's without the skin. You can see the different muscles and the attachment to the bones. When shortly before Piero is exiled from Florence in 1494, Michelangelo has a feeling that everybody is unhappy with Piero, and his close relationship with the Medici family makes him feel that he better leave. And so he's going to leave Florence to Venice, and then from Venice go to Bologna, where he is going to meet a friend of the Medici. In 1494, the French king had invaded Italy on his way to Naples that he wanted to recover. At first, Piero de' Medici had decided to prevent the French to go through. But finally, he is going to support the French. When he does, Pisa, who was depending on Florence, declares its independence, and the Florentines were so unhappy with that literally Piero had to flee. So in Bologna, Michelangelo is going to meet with the Cardinal Aldovrandi, who was a friend of the Medici. He's going to stay there for a year. What is interesting is Aldovrandi becomes very fond of Michelangelo and really goes on in his culture. He's going to read him Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. And later on, literally, as we know, Michelangelo is going to write poems, and he does it very much in the style of Petrarch. But he's also becoming quite versed in the Dante works. He's also, the cardinal is also going to become quite a protector and of Michelangelo, and provide him with some commissions. And one of the commission is to finish the tomb of St. Dominic. The commission had been given in 1469 to Niccolo dell'Arca, who was supposed to finish the upper part of that sarcophagus-like altar that contains the remains of St. Dominic. But he died too early to finish it. And so the commission is going to be given partly to Michelangelo to finish some of the statues of that part. And we'll look at this statue, and then the angel down here, and then one at the back. The program was, as you see, quite extensive, but only three statues were given to Michelangelo. And we have to remember Michelangelo is still pretty young. This is one of the statues, the one that is here, of San Petronius. And then the angel that is there. And these are still works of a young man, as you can see. He's still looking for his style. But definitely he has studied other works, and we have the beautiful folds of the vestment of St. Petronius holding a church that he's offering to God. And then at the back, and that gives you a chance to see that beautiful work of art, Michelangelo is going to sculpt the work of San Proculo. And there we can see, I think, some of the coming work, including the head. It has already something of the David that's going to come later on. He also takes an advantage of being in Bologna to look at the art around him. And again, just as he did in Florence, he's going to do it in Bologna. This is the San Petronius church in Bologna that is lacking part of its facade too. As you can see, this was done up to a point and then stopped, probably because of lack of funds, and never finished. Jacopo della Quercia, the great sculptor, was responsible for the decoration of the front porch, and it's absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately, very difficult to find illustration of it. But here are a whole series of illustration of the Old Testament, including Adam and Eve chased from the Garden of Eden. And that work that shows very much the interest in antiquity by Jacopo della Quercia became an inspiration for Michelangelo in part of the works in the Sistine Chapel, we'll see later on. There was a taste in the early Renaissance for antiquarianism. This is the idea of collecting old objects, statues, coins, whatever was associated with the antiquity, with the classical period. That had to do with the humanism at that time. And it really is going to go on, but at that time, it really gave a chance for some young sculptor like Michelangelo to make sculptures that were sold as antique sculptures and not as contemporary. And so we know that Michelangelo made 2 sculptures of Sleeping Cupid and then another one that were sold to a collector in Rome. And we'll come back to that story. I just want to describe this extraordinary Farnese Cup. And just giving you an idea on the story of an object. This is made of sardonyx agate. And so you can see different layers, and the sculptor has taken advantage of the different layer within the stone to give a description on one side. This is showing the triad of the Serapis, Isis, and Harpocrates. These where you have Isis on the bottom, and then some other figures representing the seasons at the bottom. Serapis being typically Egyptian god that had been almost put together, if we can say, by Ptolemy when he came. Ptolemy didn't care for the anthropomorphic gods in Egypt, and so took with him a god that he kind of conflated between Poseidon, between Osiris and other gods in Egypt. And this became Serapis, who had a lot of followers in this cult. So on the other side, this is the same cup. On the other side, you have the face of Medusa that is supposed to kill you when you're looking at it. It's an extraordinary work. Now, the story of the work itself is that the Farnese Cup was acquired by the treasury of Rome after Octavian's conquest of Egypt in 31 BC. It was later brought to Byzantium, then back west after the city was sacked in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. By 1239, it was in the court of Frederick II, from which it then reached the Persian court of Herat and possibly Samarkand, where we have documents tracing it over there. Then it's found its way to the court of Alfonso of Aragon in Naples, where Angelo Poliziano saw it in 1458. Lorenzo the Magnificent purchased the famous work in 1471. And from there, it came into the possession of the Farnese family through Margaret of Austria, and therefore finally ended up in the Naples Museum. So can you imagine how one work can go into so many hands? So why do I talk to you about this? Because one of the only extant work that we have of Michelangelo, of mythological work, is this Bacchus. And this, I have to go back to the story of the sleeping Cupid that he had done, had been sent to a cardinal in Rome and sold to him for quite a bit of money by a third person as an antique. And then it was discovered that it was an antique, and there was some research for who was the artist who had made it. It was pretty good. And so Michelangelo was at that time contacted by the cardinal to make another work. And the commission was actually for a friend of the cardinal, the banker Galli, Jacopo Galli, who wanted that sculpture to be in his garden, where he had a garden in the antique fashion. And you can see that it was found still in the 1530s by the Dutch artist Martin van Heemskerk, who makes an engraving of the backyard of the Galli, including the Bacchus by Michelangelo. So let's look at that Bacchus. That is quite interesting because it is not classical in ways. It's not idealized enough, showing Bacchus staggering the way that he's there, really drunken, would not have been a way for the ancients. He is rather effeminate. He has, of course, the typical garland of grapes in his hair, holding a cup in one hand. And the other, and that's the interesting thing, he has both skin of a dead lion, which is a symbol for death, and grapes, which is a symbol for life. And the grapes are also enjoyed by a little satyr that is at the back. It's a wonderful work for still quite a young artist. You know, think about it. He's 21 and he's just come to Rome, called to make that work. So he's still a very young man. By the way, the statue was transferred to Florence in 1572. So where was that marble coming? Most of the marble that Michelangelo used was coming from Carrara, which was north of Florence on the coast of the Adriatic Sea. And we can see here the town of Carrara and the multiple quarries in the back. Here is a picture of a quarry, and you can see Carrara was known for the beautiful color, very pure color of its marble, though different quarries would produce different colors of marble, some a little more creamy, some a little whiter. We know that once Michelangelo went to Rome, he stayed with the galleys, and he was paid for a horse, so he could go to Carrara and pick up the marble that he was going to use for his sculpture. Now, this was, you know, quarrying marble was not an easy thing. And if you think at that time, they had no trucks, they had limited means. And so this is the way that once the stone was cut away, it would then be taken down with ropes and then glide on pieces of wood that were rubbed with soap so that it would glide better. This was a very dangerous enterprise. As you can see here, it's called the lizzatura. So the Via de Lizza, as they say, this is the Via de Lizza, was made of log of cherry wood, which the youngest worker smeared with soap. And you see the youngest worker, who was the first one, if the rope would let go, was done with. So it is still through the galley that Michelangelo is going to have his really first big commission. The galley were friends of a French cardinal, Jean Billière de la Grolla, who was abbé of the Basilica of St. Denis and became ambassador of France to Rome, to the Pope. And he decided he wanted to commission a Pieta. And I'm showing you not at all Michelangelo, but another Pieta, because just to insist on the fact that this was a subject that was mostly used in the north of the Alps, where the portrayal of pain had been connected with the idea of redemption. It was in German called a Vesperbild, the image of the evening, and typically represented the Madonna holding the Christ body in her arms. As you can see, it's a very difficult thing to reconcile, because you have a body of Christ which is supposedly rigid, and typically the Virgin would be smaller than Christ, and so it was difficult to arrange for both works. And Michelangelo is really the first one who is able to do it beautifully together, to harmonize these. Of course, what he does is makes the body of Christ much more limp. So Michelangelo went again to Carrara he decided to go to the Bolvacio Quarry, which was known for its cream color that evokes the flesh. And he was supposed to meet the deadline of the contract. It was supposed to be in 1499. The contract was signed in 97. So he had not even 2 years to do it. So between the choosing of the marble, the delivery of the marble that would come through the sea and then through the river to Rome. So to meet that deadline, he worked some 20 hours a day just on that single block of marble. He used a chisel, then the sculptural hammer, and then he typically would polish the marble with pumice stone for weeks so that he came to the beautiful shine. The chapel in which it was supposed to go was really dark, and this was still in the old St. Peter. So it was later moved in the new St. Peter, but the chapel there was really, really dark. So what Michelangelo did, it departed from the previous Pietà very much in giving the Virgin a very young face, that is becoming eternal. Her head leans a little bit over the lifeless body, but she doesn't seem to have a lot of emotions. She's like thinking. There's that kind of absence quality to her. The face of Christ is absolutely extraordinary. There is no sense of suffering, but just a perfection in any ways, even in the body. If you look at the veins and the muscles, it's absolutely extraordinary, what they called at that time divine beauty. Now, when the statue was finished and displayed for the first time, there was a lot of noise around it. A lot of people came and wondered who was the sculptor who had done this. And so there were some words that a sculptor from the north had done it, Cristoforo Solari. And so he was known as Il Gobbo. He was kind of a dwarf person. And Michelangelo was so concerned that he came at night and then engraved his name, that Michelangelo Buonarroti made this. The only time he ever signed a sculpture. He is the extraordinary face of the Virgin. Now, one thing that I want to stress is how was he able to make this a beautiful ensemble, a beautiful group, is because he very much distorted, in fact, the size of the two. If the Virgin had to get up, she would be much, much taller than Christ. But by putting a lot of vestment around her, he dissimulates that. The same, to keep the face of the Virgin proportioned to the face of Christ, he just surrounds her face, the whole head, by a very heavy drapery, which kind of compensates for her own proportion with the body. So here is Michelangelo made it. So it's actually Michelangelo Buonarrotus Florentinus Faciebatsu. Michelangelo from Buonarroti from Florence made it. Unfortunately, beautiful things are often the center of attention for crazy people. The Virgin suffered some damages. The first one was when it was moved from the old St. Peter to the new chapel where it is now. It lost some of the four fingers of the hand that were restored in 1736 by another sculptor who, by the way, probably took some liberties in the way he repaired it. But the biggest one was in 1972 when the mentally disturbed geologist, the Hungarian-born Australian Laszlo Tost, walked into the chapel and attacked the sculpture with a geologist's hammer while shouting, "I'm Jesus Christ, I have risen from the dead." And with 15 blows, he removed Mary's arms at the elbow, you can see it here, knocked a chunk of her nose and chipped one of her eyelids. And it's interesting, it's an American sculptor, Bob Cassidy, who was there, that was one of the first people to remove Tost from the Pietà. He grabbed him by the beard and by the hair and was able to stop the massacre. And now, of course, it is very highly protected. So a quick word on Savonarola. While Michelangelo was in Rome, he knew there was a lot of unrest in Florence, and one was Savonarola. When Piero left for 4 years, Savonarola became the de facto leader of Florence and really brought a terrible atmosphere there. He made some very heavy sermon against moral corruption of the clergy and the rest of the leaders there, made sodomy, previously punishable by fine, into a capital offense. He made bonfires of the vanities, profane books and paintings. A lot of art was lost in that thing. He was promoting the art of dying well. And at the time, with the French threat of invasion, allowed the French to come in, and he was finally excommunicated in 1497 and then arrested and executed in 1498 in an absolutely horrible death way. He was tortured to the max. They just kept his right hand so he could sign the confession of his sins. And then he was taken hung over a fire that he died in being hanged, and then was burned, and his cinders were thrown in the Arno River, together with 2 of his acolytes. And this is the kind of unrest that Michelangelo heard of by his brother, but didn't live. He actually, he came back to from Rome, to Florence, because he was short of commissions in Rome. And when he came back, very quickly was put in front of a big question mark. An artist that had started a work, Agostino di Duccio, had in 1466 brought a huge block of marble to there, had received the commission and probably was going to sculpt a Hercules, but found in the process of sculpting a defect within the block and abandoned his work. And so the Signoria, the government of Florence, wanted to do something with it. And finally, against others, Michelangelo, the young Michelangelo, was chosen, though he thought by coming to Florence after the success of his Pietà in Rome, that he would be more recognized. In fact, nobody had heard of it, but it's because of the little money he was asking to do the sculpture that he received the commission. This is 3 times life size. It's a colossal statue, very similar to the colossal statues of antiquity. And once they actually made a workshop next to the Signoria, where the Palazzo Vecchio is now, for Michelangelo to be able to work. That sculpture of David departs very much of what we have seen before. If we remember on the Donatello and the Verrocchio, the David is shown after his victory. He has the head of David, of Goliath at his feet. In this case, David is there very much thinking of how he's going to do to defeat his enemy. He's holding the sling on his shoulder, really measuring what he can do. He's shown with a very fierce face, which is going to become kind of a signature for Michelangelo, who often shows his figures with that the burrowed forehead. And then also his disheveled hair, actually a copy of the symbol for Florence, the marzocco, the lion. So it's a leonine hairdo, if you want. Originally, the statue of David was supposed to be on the facade of the cathedral, and so was going to be seen from down below. And this explains, again, some of what we have worked, what's the optical correction that Michelangelo had made by having a head that is disproportionate for the body, and definitely the hand down below here, also disproportionate because it had to be seen from down below. By the distance, it would have looked too small to be perceived. When it was finished, it was considered such an incredible work of art that they decided to place it in the main square of the town in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. So imagine that it was suspended in wooden frame and rolled on 14 greased logs by over 40 men for a period of 4 days from the cathedral workshop. Sorry, it was the cathedral workshop, not the Palazzo Vecchio, to the Palazzo. And this time, it was the first time since antiquity that a nude was being exhibited in a public place. So imagine that statue being transported for 4 days from the cathedral to Palazzo Vecchio, which are not that far from one another. Michelangelo, once he knew that the location is changed, decided to add something to the sculpture. As you can see, the back of the statue, if it had been in a niche, would not have been seen. And so he is going to add actually part of the stone that's going to go into the sling that he holds into the hand. This was an addition by him later on. How does he work when he makes such a work? Yeah, this typically starts with a design, with a drawing, but then he would go with little modello and with wax. He would model the works and change the position until he would be satisfied. And very often with Michelangelo, he's going to still change once he comes to the final product. He is still going to be contact from Siena. Andrea Bregno had made the Piccolomini altar that lasted between 1481 to 1504 and needed sculpture to finish the sculptural program in there. And he is going to ask Michelangelo to finish it. And I apologize, I think I didn't do my, I didn't do my animation properly. So you can't see St. Peter, but I'll arrange that so you can look back at my presentation later on. As typically he's himself taking the sculptures that are the closest to him, because they'd be the most seen by people, and the sculptures on the top will be given to his assistant. So he will do the St. Peter, it's beauty, and I'm sorry I'm not showing it to you, and St. Paul on the other side. St. Gregory, that was supposed to be on top, will be resculpted as St. Pius II, as the Piccolomini will become a pope as St. Pius II and become very important to the family. So this is the Piccolomini altar and tomb. Then, of course, in Florence, they decide to enlarge the council room in the Palazzo Vecchio. This expansion started in 1501, where the council grew to 500 members, and they had to all be able to sit in that room. At that time, none of the paintings that you see existed. This was added by Vasari later on in 1565. And so they wanted to describe the civic history of the city. And they literally pitted Michelangelo and Leonardo as part of the makers of these new. And so these were where the paintings were supposed to be, this one by Michelangelo, this one by Leonardo. He never realized Michelangelo only made the cartoon, and Leonardo started the fresco that we don't know if it still exists, but we have some reproduction by later artists that must have seen the project. So Michelangelo makes a work that is still pretty similar in what he had done in sculpture earlier on. In the relief of the Battle of the Centaur in the lapis, where you have that interest in torsion of figures, different sides of people. But as I say, it stayed only as a cartoon, so a preparation for the fresco. And the Leonardo da Vinci, as I mentioned, the project was seen, it's only part of it, was copied by Peter Paul Rubens from a work, the preparation work of Leonardo da Vinci. As you can see, a more grandiose, dynamic work than Michelangelo. Michelangelo also received a commission for the Doni Tondo. That's one of his most famous paintings of the time, framed in an extraordinary frame from one of the greatest frame maker of the time. That was made by the Tasso family. But it shows already some of the great interest, and we can find some inspiration that will go on in the Sistine Chapel ceilings. This is, again, torsions of bodies, unusual position, very three-dimensional work between Mary, Joseph, and Christ, and then the little John the Baptist is on the side. The nude figures at the back being the pagan world. And so you have the birth of Jesus and the teaching of John the Baptist are going to be the one that are going to convert the pagans to Christianity. Around the beautiful tondo, about the frame, you have two sibyls and two prophets, and then the head of Christ at the very top. And at about the same time that he's making the David, he's also busy working for two tondos. These are high relief tondos made of marble, one for the Taddei family And you can see here again, these works that are considered non-finito seem to be unfinished, are actually not. It becomes really his signatures that puts in focus the figure of Christ that has, again, that very dynamic movement in the arms of his mother, John the Baptist, there with the cup that is a symbol for him. And well as the Madonna, the Pitti Tondo, which is another work he did at the same time. He also receives a commission from a Belgian, from a Flemish merchant for a Madonna and Child. And this is going to be, this is in the Onze Lieve Vrouwenkerk in Bruges, Our Lady's Cathedral, and is that extraordinary sculpture, the only one that left Italy during the lifetime of Michelangelo. It shows a group that is very serene. The face of the Virgin is quite inspired from the Pietà that we've seen before. And then the body of Christ, we've seen him before with that beautiful head of hair and in that torsion position that we find again and again in Michelangelo's work. Very dynamic young child compared to a very static mother who can, with that very pensive look, is looking, in fact, at the future of her child. This, by the way, also went through quite a history. During the French Revolution, it was taken to Paris and was only returned to the church after the exile of Napoleon in 1815. And then during the Second World War was taken by the German and finally put into the famous salt carriers in Altdorfer, where it was found by the monument men and brought back to Bruges at that time. In the middle of that, he received a commission to make some more sculptures for the cathedral, but never finished. The contract was drafted and then was canceled. The only thing that we have of that contract is the beginning of a statue that was never finished of St. Matthew. It was later replaced by Jacopo Sansovino, St. James. But this is also interesting to see the process of the sculpture, how the sculpture appears from the stone. It was most probably inspired by the Laocoon that Michelangelo had seen in Rome, that had been discovered in the Trajan bath. And it's the time where Michelangelo is in Rome, is meeting with Julius II, who wants to make a huge tomb for himself. Michelangelo drafts the design in agreement with the Pope. It was supposed to be more or less what you see here, with the statue of Julius at the top, Moses and Paul on the second floor, and at the bottom, two victories with prisoners that were supposed to celebrate the victories of Julius during his lifetime. For a reason we're not quite sure of, Michelangelo, who had ordered some marble, had difficulties bringing it over. And Julius suddenly changed his mind, didn't want to give him the money for the tomb, and probably listened to Bramante, and Raphael was giving a lot of works to Raphael in the different apartments. And so suddenly Michelangelo got the feeling that the Pope was against him, and as he typically did, he fled. He left Rome and went back to Florence. And I'm going to leave you there because we'll pick up on that in the next class on November 18th, when we'll talk about Michelangelo with the Sistine, Rome, and Florence. So sorry to have run a little over. So if you're still there and you want to talk, please do. You can unmute yourself. I'm going to stop the recording. Voila.